Welcome back. We are going to be looking at some custom visualizations that you can build within Domo apps. So as I explained in an earlier video, one big use of Domo apps is to build highly custom visualizations that you can't necessarily do in the card analyzer natively. Here's an example of one that I showed, which was the Jazz Stadium map. It gives information on the ROI or whatever other metric you want for each seat in this stadium here in Utah. A lot of them are used to support workflows, but a lot of them really give visualizations that you wouldn't get very easily in like a pin board or these very custom breakdowns of metrics that you wouldn't get in the analyzer. So today we're going to build one that is a bar chart race. Here's an example. Refresh the page to give you a sense of what it looks like from the very beginning. This is grabbing data from Domo that describes a bunch of threads on the IDEA Exchange. So it will cycle through each day, sum up the number of threads under each topic, and show how those change over time, and show the top 12. As you can see here, the top 12 topics change over time, and you can see the date that they're correlated to. This is a chart type that Mike Bostock, the kind of god of D3, which is a visualization library, coded up. And so this code was adapted from the code that he gave as an example of this chart type on his own website, which we've adapted to run in Domo and to also do a little bit of pre-processing of the data before we actually load it into the chart. So to give you a sense of what this data looks like, here's the data set. And there it is. So you can see the only thing I'm really pulling here is the category and the date created. So any data source, data set with a category and a date created would work for the app code that you'll be using. So where do we get the code? We're going to go to GitHub, user J Pumford, that's me, with the repo name bar chart race Domo app. Now that's public on my page, so you'll see it if you go onto my page and go to repositories. It'll be this most recent one up here. Otherwise, you can navigate directly to it by typing in github.com/jpumford/bar chart race Domo app, all hyphenated. You can download this code through this download button here, download zip, or if you have Git set up, you can use HTTPS or SSH to download it locally to your computer. Let's talk about all the different code that makes up this app. I have it open here in Visual Studio Code. A lot of these files will look very familiar. In fact, all of them should look familiar except for app.js. App.css is our styling. I really have none in this. It's all done in JavaScript, so this will be empty. App.js has the goods, the important stuff that we'll be going over. Domo.js, again, just a bunch of utility libraries loaded by Domo that we end up using. No need to modify this file or even open it up for that matter. Index.html, I have not changed it at all. It is vanilla hello world. Manifest.json, what I have changed is I've added this mapping that allows me to query the data set. I've added in the dataset ID as I found it in my instance, and I've given it the alias discussion. I haven't added any fields to it because we don't need to the way things are configured right now. The app has an ID because I've already published it. You will probably be missing these two keys. That's okay. And I also have a thumbnail so that way I can publish it when the time comes. It's blank, as you can see. So let's look at app.js. It's pretty dense. This is about 230 lines of D3 code. Not all of it's D3. I'd say maybe everything here is just cleaning the data up, getting it ready to use, and everything down here is actually rendering it. So a word about D3. D3 is a library that's used to make custom visualizations. It's kind of the standard that people use in the industry. There are a lot of new libraries coming around that are easier to use, but there are very few that are as customizable and as powerful as D3. However, with that customizability comes some difficulty of use. I will be perfectly upfront and say that some of Mike Bostock's code, I haven't spent the time to understand exactly what it's doing. And that's fine. A lot of the times when you're building visualizations, you don't necessarily have time to understand the details. You just have to accept that you may not be able to modify it the way you'd like. And that's okay. So the vast majority of this worked out of the box, and what didn't, I had to understand and go through and edit and change so that it would work in the context of a Domo app. The biggest hurdle at first to go over was to get the data cleaned up in a way that I could pass it to this chart. So if we go back to the data source, or data set in this case, and we look at the data, notice it's fairly flat. We have the category and we have the date created. So for each post in the dojo, we have an entry in our data set. What we need in our app, let's navigate back here, is keyframes, if you will. In other words, we need things keyed by day. We need to know for each day how many cumulative discussions we have under a given topic. And that's going to require a little bit of processing. You could do this processing through a data flow. You could do it in SQL as part of those data flows. You could do it in Magic ETL, whatever you're most comfortable with. I'm most comfortable with JavaScript, and I thought it would be fastest for me to do it, actually process the data in the app. That's not necessarily the most efficient choice to choose, but at the end of the day, visualizations need to get done, and so whatever it takes to get there, as long as the performance is on an acceptable level, it really doesn't matter. So if we go back into here, you'll note that I start by setting up some configuration. To explain what these different constants do, duration is the duration of each tick, how long we spend in milliseconds on each day. Margin is just some display variables, just something that looked pretty. Bar size, again, same thing, it's the width of each bar. N, that's how many bars we have at one time. So if something drops into 13th place because I'm only holding 12 bars, it will be removed off of the page. Or if something from 13th moves up to 4th or even 12th place, it will then re-enter the page. Width gives me the width of the chart as I want it. This isn't responsive, but it could definitely be modified to be responsive. And then our height is computed based on the prior configuration. This is probably the most important part. You'll recognize this from our Sugarforce app. We're building a query here. We are querying Domo for data /v1, and then we're putting in our data set alias, which is discussions as defined, as you remember here, in manifest.json. And we've selected the two fields that I mentioned earlier, date created and category. We're also using a different feature, order by, which allows us to order either ascending or descending by a specific column. So I've chosen date created and ascending. So I have things in chronological order, essentially. I run domo.get on that query, and then with the data I get back, which is just an array, I compute the keyframes. I compute the name frames, which are like the keyframes, but rather than keyed by the date in ascending order, I actually have them keyed by companies. It makes manipulating the data a little bit easier later. Previous gives me information on the transitions from different ranks, and next also does the same thing, but in a forward-looking way. And then we just run the main function here, render chart. We give it the keyframes, the name frames, previous, and next. Let's look at the keyframes. Data. As you'll remember, the data that's being sent back is an array, and it's actually an array of objects. So what that will look like is something like this, where we've got a category, and then a date created, which is an ISO timestamp. So like 2012, 2021, 04, 22, and then a time after it. So we'll just call it midnight. And this is essentially what all the data will look like, except it will be potentially thousands of rows rather than just the one. We use a few functional style array mapping functions here. Reduce transforms an array. So for each element of the array, each datum, we split the date created on this T because we're not too concerned about the time when it was created. We're more concerned about the date part up here. We grab the date part. If we have already added that date part to our map of dates to categories, then we increment that category by 1. Otherwise, we actually create the element in the map showing dates mapped to categories, mapped to number of things that have been created by that date within that category. Then next we do what's called a sliding window algorithm. Essentially, we are summing totals over time via a sliding window. This one's a little bit more complicated. It is a fairly common algorithm at the same time. If you're familiar with JavaScript, you should be able to digest this after running through it. One very common technique I see for understanding what code does is to go through it and actually log out to the console what the data is at any point in time. So if we were to run this app, we would actually see in the console what our data looks like at this point in our program. Next, we then take the map of dates to categories to number of conversations in that category, and we actually convert that into arrays. So at this point, our data looks something like this. 2021, 0422 is the key, which then maps to a bunch of different categories. So dojo. And then by that date, we have maybe 34 discussions. And let's say we have an app platform category, and we have 36 discussions on that. This is what our data looks like at this point. So then we map over it, over each date, and then we generate an array from it. And what that ends up looking like is dates like so with objects after it, with the category, give me. And so on. This is what our keyframes look like. This is what our D3 chart will expect as an input. Nameframes previous and next will be out of scope for this specific tutorial. The next relevant function is render chart. We pass the keyframes, the name frames, previous and next. So let's look at what render chart looks like. We start by creating an SVG programmatically via D3 in the body tag. As you can see here, we've selected the body tag in the HTML file, and we're appending an SVG tag to it. We're also giving it a view box of the width and height that we specified earlier. We create the bars, we create the axes, we create the labels, and then we create the ticker. The ticker is the part in the lower right that shows what date we're looking at data for. We then, as a response, as a return value to all of these functions, get functions that allow us to update those specific portions of the chart. So we've created the bars. We get a function back that allows us to update the bars. Then we go through each keyframe in the keyframe. We define a transition, and then we update the axis with the new keyframe, update the bars, update the labels, and update the tickers. And then we wait for the transition to be over. And this loops over and over and over and over again until it ends. So let's get this into Domo. We're going to need a terminal in the directory in which the Domo exists, or the app exists. We're going to go into manifest.json, and because you won't have the same ID as me, you're going to want to delete these lines and save that. From within the directory, you're going to run Domo publish. I've already published, so I won't run it. And then once you've published, you'll go into your instance. Still running. Go into asset library. You'll have bar chart race. From there, you'll create a new card. You'll scroll down, wire up a data set. Mine will be automatically wired up because I have put the correct ID in my manifest. But for you, you'll want to click on this and choose whatever data set it is you'd like to feed into this. The only requirements are it needs a category column that's written exactly like this, uppercase C and all, and a date created column that also is capitalized the exact same way and is a date field. This needs to be a string field. As long as you've chosen a data set with those requirements, the app will work for you. And of course, I can go back home to show an example of the app running. Just like that. So there you have it. For further reference on custom visualizations, again, understanding that D3 is a pretty intense library to be using, but a very powerful and a great choice in a lot of circumstances. There are a few others that you could use. If you're using React, which it's most likely will be using React, some that I've liked are recharts, which I actually use at work currently. React Viz, VIS, which I've used in the past and I think is supported by Uber. That one we've actually used on several visualizations in custom apps at Domo as well. And VisX, VISX. This one's a little bit lower level, but is probably closer to D3 than, the closest to D3 out of all those React libraries. And I believe at least a few of them are based on D3. And you are perfectly welcome to use D3 in React, of course. It works just fine. It will just take a little bit of using hooks properly to get data updating, as you would expect. So thanks for joining, and hope you'll be able to hear the third talk, which I think will be the most interesting out of all of them, where I will be showing an app where you can load a data source, view all of the columns, and annotate that data set and write that data back into Domo to be used later in another data